Hello, everyone. This is Marcos from Flow Design Architects with a continuation of our video series, Buying Properties. In the last video, we discussed some of the elements that you need to consider while buying an existing residential property. So if you haven't looked at that video, please make sure to go and get familiar with the topics that we discussed, because today we're going to talk a little bit more about things to consider while buying properties, existing properties that are commercial. So very important that you get familiar with the previous videos so you get a sense of where we are with this particular topic. So let's get into it. So while buying an existing property that is commercial, as architects, every time that we meet with clients, we make sure to kind of talk to them about several things that you need to think about and you need to be aware of when you're trying to develop an existing building. So when you buy an existing property, commercial property, you need to consider or you need to be aware of which zoning district you are located, the building use, building levels, building area, means of egress, fire separation, sprinkler systems, fire alarms, and additional code requirements that we're going to talk about in a couple minutes. We're going to dip into each of these categories so you get familiar how does that affect you trying to develop this property. So let's get into it. Zoning district. If you don't know what zoning districts are, we created a video specifically just focusing on the idea of zoning and how that relates. So if you haven't looked at that video, please make sure to go back to our playlist and go and find that video that talks about where we talk about zoning as a concept. So each city had these zoning districts. So when you're trying to develop an existing commercial property, it's very important that you understand where you are located within the zoning and how that relates to what you're trying to develop. For example, if you are in a commercial zoning district and you go into your table of uses that are permitted for that particular zoning, you might realize that if you buy a commercial space that is a restaurant, and in that area restaurants are allowed, and you're trying to convert it into, let's say, a daycare or like an industrial space, you wouldn't be able to do that because the zoning district specified this area of industrial buildings are not allowed. So it's very important that you get familiar into which district you are located and how that relates into the building and the business that you're trying to develop within that building. So very, very important. So, and we're going to show some images of examples so that way you get familiar with that concept. So very important that you understand your zoning district and how that relates into what you're trying to do within that building. Number two, building use. So the building use, it's something that, we always try to make sure that people understand. Not every business is the same. Not every building is the same. So which they relate directly to the building use of that particular building. So the International Building Code, right now it's 2022, we are using the 2015 IBC or International Building Code, should divide these building uses in several categories. So these categories are assembly or group A, business group B, educational group E, factory group F, high hazard group H, institutional group I, mercantile group M, meaning retail spaces, and residential group R. So when you understand the subdivisions of this use group, by the International Building Code, you can understand of like the implications of this type of uses within that existing building that you're trying to renovate. So for example, if you buy, let's say, a commercial space, an existing commercial space that is business right now, for example, there is, I don't know, insurance office, or there is, some types of business that is being used within that space. And let's say you try to, I don't know, convert it into retail or mercantile space. There are implications that you need to understand by doing that change of use. You are changing the use from business into mercantile or M. And there are things within the international building codes that you need to consider and get familiar with in order to kind of get the sense of what you're trying to accomplish. I always recommend people to hire an expert. No, don't try to just get into the International Building Code and start reading. There are a lot of implications that deal with that. So I don't recommend people to just start reading the International Building Code and try to figure it out, because that comes with experience. And there are amendments in Massachusetts. We have amendments to the International Building Code. So you not only you need to consider this code, but also the amendments that are related to that particular code. So very important that you get familiar with the use groups, and maybe potentially, if you are interested in knowing more, we potentially might be able to do videos that talk specifically to these uses individually. So that way you get familiar what you're trying to do and are trying to accomplish. So let's go back. So number 2, building use. We already talked about a little bit about it. Building levels. So very important. So the building code, depending on the use group, specify the levels that are allowed for that particular use group. For example, you might realize that buildings that are business use tend to be a little bit, have several levels compared to a space that might be used for high hazard or a factory. You typically don't see factories being too high in terms of levels. And there are reasons for it that you need to get familiar with in the International Building Code. But it's important that you realize that the levels kind of play a big factor in that. And there is a table in the International Building Code that, depending on the use group, it also gives you the levels that are allowed within that use group. So it's very important that when you try to develop an existing commercial space, you understand the use group and how that relates into your building allowable levels. Because if you, let's say you try to have 10 floors for a factory building, you might realize that the code specifically said, these many levels are not allowed. So that's something that you wouldn't be able to do. So those are things that you need to consider. Also, within that same line of building levels, you need to consider the building area, how big this building is. So it might be different between an assembly group. Assembly are spaces where people gather, like, spaces of worship, nightclubs. It's funny that I kind of got those two together, but nightclubs, spaces of worship, spaces where people gather. So let's say you're trying to develop an existing commercial space, and right now it's a church, it's an assembly use. But you're trying to, let's say, I don't know, make it either an institutional space, and you might realize that the building area plays a big factor to that, because depending on the use, you are allowed to build larger, and also it relates into your sprinkle systems. Because if you have an area that is a small area, let's say for a business use, you are allowed to have this is an example, and I would advise you to go into the building code to understand the areas that are allowed for these different particular uses. But let's say you are in a business, you bought a commercial space that is business, and you have 10,000 square feet of space. You buy this one, and then you realize, oh my God, I have a big land. I would like to add to that 10,000 square feet, but then you need to go back into international building code, and in the international building code will tell you, in this B group or business use group, the area allowable, let's say, is 100,000 square feet, which is it's a lot more than what is allowable. But just as an example, let's say the allowable area by the International Building Code is 100,000 square feet. That means that you have 90,000 square feet of area that you could play. Now, of course, it depends of how big your lot is within that area. But there is something within the building code that specify that if your building is a sprinkle, now that area might double, or there are different math within the code. You have to always go back to the International Building Code so you understand like what that relationship is. So for example, if the allowable is 100,000 square feet and your building is a sprinkle, now you time that, let's say times 2. So that means that if you try to develop an existing commercial space that is business use group, if the allowable is 100,000 square feet, and the code says, because your building is a sprinkle, now you can time it times 2. Now you have 200 square feet, 200,000 square feet that you could play within that space. So it's very important that you get familiar with these topics, and we as a business here at Flow Design, we are hoping that these videos will help developers and regular people out there in our communities to get familiar to these topics, so you can, when you hire a professional, an architect, an engineer, you get familiar with these topics, so you understand the implications of what you're trying to do. So very, very, very important. So I'm going to be, let me delete this here. So now that we talk a little bit about the building area, let's talk a little bit about means of egress. Means of egress, you will hear this all the time. Means of egress, ways to get out of a space. So, for example, the means of egress for a business building might be different than an assembly group. And you can see it, like there are assembly, like the code, we are dealing with a church right now. And let's say you have less than 500 people. Let's say you have 499 people within that assembly group. The building code says that you are only required to have two exits within that, for exits to the exterior of the building, for that amount of people. But the moment that you get to 500, now that requirement goes to three exits. So very important that you understand that. And now this amount of people go back to the table that talks about the occupancy load, and maybe we might need to do a video about that later in the future, but not now, because the occupant load. Let's say we have a church right now. Let's say your church members are 75 people, but you have an area that is, let's say, 10,000 square feet. That 10,000 square feet will, if you subdivide these areas depending on what the building code allowed and the calculation for occupant load, you will realize that that 10,000 square feet might give you, an occupant load of 300 people. So it does not matter that your members are only 75 members for the church. You need to count for the people that the building could fit within that space. So very important that you understand the relationship and how the use groups relate to the means of egress. So very, very important. That happens a lot with assembly use groups, because the building code also says that if you have an area within, let's say, a business, right? Let's say you have an office. Let's say you have an office, right? And let's say this is your office, and you have an area that is a conference room, right? You have a conference room. The code says if less than 50 people within any area, you only need one exit. You only need one exit. So let's say you have 49 people, only need one exit. The moment that that space can fit 50 people, now you need two exits out of that because of the amount of people that are within that room. So it's very, very important that you understand how the means of egress plays with the use groups and how you're utilizing the spaces. Very, very important. Let's keep moving forward within these topics. Now that we know a little bit about the means of egress, and maybe we can subdivide these topics in other videos, but now that you understand the means of egress, fire separation plays a big factor when you try to develop an existing commercial space, and if you are trying to change the use. So for example, the building code, specifically if you go to the International Building Code, says that you need to have certain fire separation between each, like depending of the use groups that you have. So you need to go into the table that specifically talks about fire separation, because the fire separation between, let's say, an educational space, let's say you have a building that has educational space on one side and it has business on another side of the same building. This is a multi-use building, right? The building code might say, and this is just examples. You need to go back into the building code to get familiar into the specific numbers, but this is just an example. The building code might say that between use group, educational, and business, you need to have a 1 hour fire separation in between the two use groups within that building. Now, what about if you have an educational space and then you are trying to have a factory within the same building, or a high hazard space? And the code might say that you are not allowed to have them side by side, but this is just theory. Let's say you're trying to do a high hazard business within that building. So high hazard. And what high hazard means is spaces that are that you have chemicals and things that might explode, or like gas companies that have a lot of tanks, like propane tanks and things like that, things that well, the same name says it, high hazard spaces. So let's say you have a building that is 10,000 square feet, and you have 5,000 square feet that is educational right now, and you're trying to create a high hazard space. So before, if it was a business, it was an hour. But now that is a high hazard, the building code might say that this is a 3 hour fire separation between the two spaces, which means that then this wall, the construction of that wall needs to be treated differently than if it was a 1 hour. So you see the importance of the understanding these relationships and how they apply into what you are trying to accomplish within that same building. So very important to understand the concept of fire separation. Now, sprinkle systems relate to that. So if you're trying to develop an existing commercial space and you realize, oh my God, I don't have any fire alarm, and then you try to change the use group or make a big renovation within the building, the code will tell you, oh, now, and the building commissioner or building inspector might tell you, hey, wait a second, you are changing the use or you're renovating the space. Now you are required to install a sprinkler system or a fire alarm because you are changing the use or you are renovating an existing space, that you're trying to, renovate that area. So that will trigger these requirements. So very important that you get familiar with this, so you don't get to a situation where you are planning to renovate and spend, let's say, $100,000, and now the building inspector tells you, oh my God, you need to either install a fire alarm and a sprinkler system, which is going to add cost to your construction, and also you need to hire a professional, you need to hire a sprinkler engineer, you need to hire a fire alarm engineer and consultant to be able to accommodate these requirements. Because I always tell people, it's not that easy just to say, oh, have the architect, place where these items are. No, now you have to hire professionals that deal with those particular items within the building, the industry. So very important. And now there are also, lastly, there are also things that you need to consider that are additional core requirements for these particular use groups. So we are in Massachusetts, we're in Salem, Massachusetts. So Massachusetts has an amendments to the International Building Code, and these amendments relate to either the use groups that you're trying to renovate. So it's very different than if you are, let's say, in Texas, or you are in Utah, or you are in Nevada. They might not have the amendments that Massachusetts has for the International Building Code. So it's important that you understand that not only you need to focus and see what the International Building Codes require for this, to renovate this existing commercial space, but also any additional requirements that deals with that. For example, if you are trying to change the use, a commercial use, let's say from a barber shop, a business, to, let's say, let's say assembly, to an assembly space. Let's say you want to convert it from a barber shop to a restaurant. The building codes will tell you, you're allowed to increase the area, you need to have more exit signs and things like that. But then you go into the additional code requirements, and then you are like, okay, well, now the restaurant needs a kitchen, needs an area for a mop sink, needs a hand washing station, it needs a grease trap, so those things are additional items that you need to be considered if you're trying to renovate an existing commercial space and you're trying to change the use, in this particular example, from barber shop into a restaurant. So very, very important. And we always try, the reason why we're doing these videos is so people can get familiar with these topics and get knowledgeable about them. So very, very important. So this is the end for this video. We are going to be discussing in future videos how these particular use groups and different topics relate. But at this moment, this is the end for this video. So thank you so much for watching.